With the ending of Invincible Season 1, we were given the twist that Invincible's father, Omni Man, was not only Earth's greatest fraud, but he was from a race of super Nazis whose mission is to conquer every planet in the universe. This led to one of the most emotional and brutal fights in the series, with Mark getting absolutely slaughtered by Omni Man. This raises the question, what if this occurred when Mark was a lot stronger? What if Mark from the Viltrumite War in Season 4 fought Nolan from the same time period? Since a topic like this is coming from Invincible, where Mark can go from flying light years in weeks to getting outsped by a dragon slower than the average network connection in the depths of the Grand Canyon, there are going to be inconsistencies in the scaling between the show and the comics. This is also true since it's outright stated by the creators that the show is a second draft of the comics. So because of this, we'll be splitting the fight up into 2 rounds. Round 1 being Mark versus Nolan in the comic, and round 2 covering the show. I'll try to keep things as brief as I can, since I don't want to cover every argument for these two, but I'll cover all the relevant feats and statements for this fight. And for the sake of not delving into any confusion, we'll just say both of these guys are going all out from the jump. And if you really want a scenario laid out in your mind, let's just pretend Nolan called Debbie a pet before ripping Eve's head off right in front of Mark, so Mark is completely bloodlusted with no need to hold back on his dad. Before we get into the fight, I would like to ask you to like and subscribe to the channel. This is my first longer form video using my voice, and for my current fanbase that watches me for my YouTube shorts, don't worry, those won't be stopping anytime soon. And let me know what you think of this video and whether you want to see more of this type of content. And with that being covered, let's just get into the comic scaling for this fight. Getting into the comic scaling between Mark and Nolan, it's important to go through the statements comparing these two directly, and unfortunately for Mark, almost none of these statements are in his favor, like at all. The main statements that get used for this comparison are made by Alan in Conquest. In Conquest's case, he just outright states that Mark is only almost on Nolan's level, and Alan says that Mark has no chance at stopping him because Nolan couldn't stop him. Now, as an Invincible fan, this does look pretty bad for Mark, but there are a couple ways of defending these two statements to make it just a bit more arguable for him. In Conquest's case, Mark has gotten stronger since the last time they fought. This is likely the case from the wording at the end of Conquest vs. Mark Round 2, where Mark states that Conquest was so much stronger than him back then, but now Mark is able to do a lot more damage to him with just his normal punches and kicks, and is able to keep Conquest in a chokehold, which albeit can be tied to him off-guarding Conquest and knocking the wind out of him, but this is still just a better display as opposed to previously in Season 3, where Mark was getting absolutely battered by Conquest and sent across the entire planet, and he had him on his hands and knees to where Mark was asking for a timeout. However, the exact same case can be made for Nolan. We don't even know the last time Conquest saw Nolan, let alone saw him in a full-on fight. If anything, his wording in his first fight with Mark implies he hasn't seen Nolan in action in years, since he states that your father has showed so much promise when he was younger, not even noting any significant achievements he has now, or glazing his reputation for conquering hundreds of planets like most other Viltrumites do. Even if you do want to ignore the skepticism on Conquest's knowledge of Nolan's strength, that doesn't excuse Alan's statement, and he's someone who's not only teammates with Nolan and Mark, but he's fought with Nolan in a tag team against the Executioners and fought with Mark in the war. Some people do take Alan's statement too far, admittedly, and imply this means Mark is a tier below Nolan, which I don't think is true, and can work just as well if you interpret it as Mark being on Nolan's level, but slightly weaker. This is because Alan literally no-diffed Nolan. It wasn't even close at all, and Nolan couldn't do anything. So obviously if Mark is just on Nolan's level, he isn't going to have a chance like Alan implies. A common argument for Mark's superiority at this point is that he beat Conquest, who is stated stronger than Nolan by people like Cecil, and his soundtrack being called the second strongest Viltrumite, which would include people like Nolan, but the soundtrack name was changed to Mr. 10 Times Worse, which is just in reference to Cecil's statement in the Season 3 teaser trailer, which would get Conquest at least above Anissa, which leads credence to him being above Nolan. So the chain scaling would at least be that Mark would be above Conquest, who's above Nolan. Even though I do think that Conquest is stronger than Nolan, at least in this point in the series, which is a topic that I can get into in a whole other video, I also think that Mark is weaker than Conquest as well. This may be contested with Conquest not even being able to remove Mark's grip, but like I said a bit ago, the only reason Mark got Conquest in that position to begin with was because Conquest very stupidly went after Oliver, which left him open to being tackled and having all his oxygen knocked out of his lungs. I know it seems a bit weird to argue that Viltrumites can get weaker from a lack of oxygen, because they're explicitly stated to being able to survive without oxygen for a long period of time, but we see with someone like Oliver, he can't just continue fighting after getting the wind knocked out of him, and has to go to a nearby planet to get a breath to even continue the fight. This makes Conquest look infinitely better, because not only is he potentially nerfed due to a lack of oxygen, but he's able to do significant damage to Mark with just a few gut shots, which you may remember differently from the show, but yeah, in the comic, Conquest is able to make Mark's spine poke his back with just a few punches, and eventually gives him the Rengoku and Ace bundle. It's also just directly stated in the comic that Conquest is a spectator to his fights and wasn't fully invested, so you can argue he wasn't truly going all out until it was too late. With all that being said, it does paint a clear picture that Mark is definitely in Nolan's tier of power, but he shies away from being his equal. Because of this, I just have to give Nolan the win. He's not only a little bit above Mark in stats, but he's also just a lot more experienced and diverse in combat, due to actually using Viltrumite hand chops frequently in combat, which will do lethal damage to Mark at some point, and will leave him parched of any chance to win this fight. Now, with all this being covered in the comics, does this change at all in the show? Compared to the comics, the show has a lot more statements comparing these two and the people they fight, and they change the context of some statements. In the show, Nolan is the one making the claim that Mark is almost as strong as him instead of Conquest, which from an immediate glance is pretty damning, since the last time Nolan has even seen Mark was on Thraxa, where he was a lot weaker. However, I don't think this statement is meant to be read that way. This isn't just me pulling made up shit out of thin air either. No, there are actually quite a few issues with Mark from Season 2 being as strong as Nolan is now. For one, this is Nolan right after the prison break, where we see him put in equal amounts of force in the combo attack with him and Alan, which turned this unfortunate Viltrumite executioner into a pile of paste that I cannot display on YouTube for obvious reasons. A common rebuttal I've seen to this is that Nolan was flying up, and therefore would be charging up his punch compared to Alan just throwing out a regular haymaker. This is true, but it's irrelevant to the comparison. Mark in Season 2 also throws a charged up punch at Anissa, several actually, and the damage he did to her was the equivalent to Debbie punching Nolan. Absolutely nothing. Which is important because the same Anissa is shown to be weaker than Alan when Alan is able to draw blood from her, despite the fact that Anissa was blocking his punch. So it's really hard to argue Season 2 Mark is on Nolan's level when he can't even draw blood from someone weaker than Alan, and Nolan on the other hand can equal out the force of his punch. The statement not being in reference to Season 2 Mark becomes more consistent with Nolan's later performance against Anissa, where he's actually able to put up a fight unlike Mark, who was getting flailed around across the globe like a ping pong ball, almost as bad as Conquest was doing him in the previous section. I've seen some people argue Nolan got stronger between the start of Season 4 and Episode 7 from the training in Episode 6, which mainly comes from a YouTuber named Bubbles, and while I do think the argument has some merit to it, it does have some flaws. The training was mainly meant to make Oliver stronger, and while we do see he did get stronger, it's not like he was doing significantly better prior to the training as opposed to after. He's still just in that weird tier where he's below all the adult Viltrumites, but is able to keep up enough to react and damage them. It's not some massive change that you would expect to be shown if he went from Season 2 Mark level to Anissa level. It's also just weird to argue Nolan got a bigger change in strength compared to Oliver. This may be a bit of speculation, but me personally, I would think Oliver has a lot more room and potential to grow compared to someone like Nolan, but that might just be me. Now, a lot of you may be wondering, well then what does this statement mean? And the obvious next meaning for this statement is that he's just saying Mark as of Season 4 is almost as strong as Omni Man, which may have you believe that this is just a done set fight and Mark just immediately loses like last round due to skill diff and being weaker due to similar reasoning. But there is one big difference, which is that Mark has a lot of plot armor. He has rage boost, which I honestly don't know what to call this since the show doesn't even define it well, and I honestly don't even think Kirkman himself knows what the hell it is. The point is that there is a distinct difference in power between Mark while casual and Mark while enraged and bloodlusted. I know this is weird since Kirkman seemingly debunked the adrenaline theory, but I don't apply this to adrenaline. When the Flaxens first show up, Mark goes from getting beaten to a pulp to instantly getting the upper hand once he gets mad after seeing Eve almost get killed. He later attributes this to him getting angry. In the season 1 finale, he can do visibly better against Nolan in short bursts after Nolan said his mom is a worthless dog. He definitely said that. No paraphrasing whatsoever. He does better after letting loose against Thula and fighting for the kill after seeing a bunch of dead Thraxens bleeding out. He does way better against Conquest in their first fight after Eve gets turned into Ace's long-lost brother, to the point where he goes from not doing any damage to Conquest with his normal punches to shattering his gauntlet. This even extends to Season 4, where he does visibly better against Lucan in Episode 5, where he's enraged after finding out this dumbass let Conquest survive, as opposed to Episode 7, where he isn't angry and is getting put in chokeholds by actual jobber Viltrumites. I think you get the point. It's just consistent that seemingly Mark can't go completely all out unless he's angry. This is important because Mark in Episode 7, while in this state of not going completely all out, is able to fight relatively with Anissa like how Nolan did in the same episode. The difference being that Nolan is also seemingly a bit distracted while fighting Anissa and trying to go after Thrag, which it's fair to say off of that he's a bit stronger than this more casual Mark, which does line up with the initial statement and makes it pretty consistent. However, it does imply that Mark would then be a little bit stronger than Nolan while enraged or fully going all out, which is the scenario I laid out for this video. Some people bring up their performances against Thrag and how Nolan is able to tank stronger punches and actually move Thrag. Meanwhile, Mark, while enraged, can't move Thrag at all. This is pretty disingenuous in my opinion because it does remove a bit of context. When Nolan moves Thrag, it's when Thrag has all of his attention on Mark and is mid-lecture with him, and Nolan just off-guards him. Both times when Mark punches Thrag, it's when Thrag is either testing him and visibly bracing for his attack, and at the end of the fight where Nolan has just seemingly died, and the only person Thrag could be focused on is Mark. Everyone else left the fight. So I don't think Nolan performs any better striking feats than Mark, but I also don't think his durability feats are anything above Mark at all. He got sent flying and survived both punches. I don't think there's anything to suggest Mark couldn't survive either of those punches similarly to Nolan, especially due to the fact that they're just stated to be around the same level bare minimum. So if we were to seriously make this argument, it would imply that Nolan is way stronger than Mark, which is obviously not what the narrative is trying to entail. Moving on from that, there is another feat in the same episode that people use to show Nolan being superior to Mark, which is him pulling Mark in the planet Viltrum destruction. While it is pretty obvious Nolan had to pull Mark in that instance, I don't think it's due to him being slower. Mark just shows uncertainty towards destroying the planet, literally saying they cannot do it, and while they're charging at the planet, the man literally turns his head right away before contact. So it's safe to say Nolan pulled him closer because Mark was uncertain and nervous and thereby not going full speed, which is definitely the case because he keeps up after Nolan lets go of him. It's not like Nolan was pulling him the entire way through. That would be a pretty stupid but funny image. Aside from those things, there isn't really anything to debunk the notion that Mark, while enraged, is at least a little stronger than Nolan. But again, these guys should be on the same level, and a fight between them could go either way, but I do lean on Mark having a greater chance of winning while enraged due to his greater strength and likely speed edge, and probably having the pain tolerance to edge out a win more times than not. This isn't to say Nolan can't win. I do believe in some scenarios he can win if he lands a Viltrumite chop to one of his vitals correctly near the start of the fight, but I don't see how likely it is that Mark tries to choke him like Lucan did, which he probably won't do since Mark has a strength edge and ability to win through conventional means, unlike against Conquest. I'd say Mark wins 5 to 6 times out of 10. I guess he really was